What's up, y'all? Today we'll be creating a simple but scalable tutorial system like the example you see on screen. This is the system I personally use to ensure my tutorials don't get messy and coupled to every other gameplay system in my games. So to begin with, the problem we're trying to solve is one that many developers, especially new developers, tend to struggle with. Let's say you make a really cool game, but you want to teach the player how to actually play it. Well, what happens a lot of the time is you end up making some tutorial that is super heavily coupled to all of your game systems, like player movement, for example. And it ends up getting super messy and breaking random parts of the game. We want to create a system where the tutorial can run on its own and just listen for events that the gameplay systems call, rather than the gameplay systems being dependent on the tutorial itself. The system we'll build today specifically decouples gameplay from tutorial, and has a lot of really cool ways you can scale it up and build other systems on top of the architecture in this video. I'll point out some other ways you can use this pattern in your games at the end of the video. All right, so let's get started. So first off, we are in a 5.7 project, but this should work in pretty much any Unreal Engine version that you may be working in. Here in this project, it's mostly empty. We have a simple character setup that we're going to be using in our example later in the video. I have a mostly empty map and a few inputs that we're also going to be using as an example. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a gameplay event manager. So let's make a new blueprint of type object. And this will be called BP Gameplay Event Manager. Now, this class is going to be extremely simple. It's barely going to have anything in it. First thing we're going to have is an event dispatcher on gameplay event. And we're going to have a couple of inputs. First one will be an event tag, which we will talk more about very soon in this tutorial because it's very important, but not yet. So we need a event tag, which is a gameplay tag. And then we just want an instigator, which will be an actor. And then we need one function called broadcast gameplay event. And this is also going to have our inputs of event tag and instigator. Instigator, event tag, and gameplay tag. And all we're going to do in this function is call our event dispatcher. So all we're doing here is this gives us a function that we can call from other parts of our game that will then call our event dispatcher. So any actors, any objects that are listening for gameplay events will be able to just listen to this one event call instead of events all throughout our game. So one other set of things we need to make before we can actually create our tutorial manager is information on a tutorial. So let's go into our content. Let's make a new folder called data and tutorials, whatever you want to call it. You can put it somewhere else if you like. We are going to make a structure called tutorial step. So this structure holds the data for each individual step of any given tutorial. So we need two things in here. First, we need our instruction text. It's a string. The next thing you need is the required event tag. So this is our tag that is required to pass this tutorial step. So it's going to be gameplay tag. Okay, the next thing we're going to make is our data asset, primary data asset. So let's create a new blueprint class here and call, make that of type primary data asset. So PDA, tutorial, and we'll open that up. And so here we are just defining some data, some variables that will exist in any tutorial. So let's create 3 variables. First off, we need tutorial name. Then we want steps, which is going to be an array of our tutorial step. This will be all the steps inside of the tutorial. Okay, and the last thing we're going to need here is a widget. So tutorial widget. Now this is optional. You don't necessarily need to have this here, but this just allows us to use a different widget depending on what tutorial is active. So we need a type user widget class reference. So we can compile and save that. And now we're ready to make our actual tutorial manager. So let's go into our blueprints, game instance, managers, and let's create a new tutorial folder, tutorial manager. Again, you can put this wherever you'd like. This is just the structure I personally prefer. So we'll make a new blueprint class of type object. Remember, this is just going to be an object that is owned by our game instance. BP tutorial manager. So there's going to be a handful of functions in here. To start with, we're going to make the function for creating our widget. So create tutorial widget. And here we're going to create widget. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Create widget, like so. Now that does require a world context object because we are an object, not an actor. We don't have a world on this actor, or this object, I should say. So we are going to get outer, which is going to be our game instance in this case. And our game instance will have a reference to the current world, which is why we can use that for our world context object. We're going to get player controller to set our owning player. And so for the class, we don't have the variable we need yet. So we're going to create a new variable for current tutorial. And this is going to be of type PDA tutorial. Now this is going to store all of the information for the current active tutorial. So we need to pass in our class. So let's get our tutorial, get tutorial widget. And we just chuck that in there. So from there, we are going to promote this to a variable, tutorial widget. And we will add to viewport. Next up, we will create the function for advancing our step. So advance step. This will be called every time we want to progress in the tutorial. So from here, we are going to need an index. So current step index is going to be an integer. So in order to advance our step, we are going to increment our index. And then we are going to check if it's greater than our current tutorial's steps length. So we're going to get steps. We're going to get length. We are going to subtract 1 from this because our index starts at 0. But the length doesn't start from 0, length starts from 1. And we will just check this. And if this is true, that means our tutorial needs to end. That means we've finished the tutorial. But we don't have that function yet, so we'll come back to it in just a minute. If our tutorial doesn't end, that means we need to go on to the next step. So we will create a event dispatcher called onActivateNewStep. And so here we need our tutorial name. Pass that in as a string, and then we need our tutorial step. This is going to be a single step information, so tutorial step, like so. And now on false, we can call this. And so here we're just going to get information from our current tutorial. So we can get tutorial name. And the step is going to be our steps, get copy, at the index of our current step. Let's clean that up just slightly. Otherwise, it's going to bother me. Okay, there we go. Now our UI can listen to when we advance our step. In terms of the functionality within this manager, the index is what's important. So whatever index we have currently set is the event we're going to be listening for, and I'll explain what that means in a second. We're almost to that point in the tutorial. But this here is how we actually have our widgets listen and update what's being displayed on the screen. So now let's create the function for ending the tutorial. So end tutorial. So in end tutorial, we are just going to get our widget and remove from parent. We're going to set our current step index to -1, not 0, because if we start at 0, when we start the tutorial, we do advance the step. So then we would actually start at 1 when the tutorial starts, which isn't what we want. So we're setting it to -1. And then we're going to get another event dispatcher. So this is going to be called on tutorial completed. And we are just going to pass in the current tutorial. So the completed tutorial, which is of type PDA tutorial. And now any other systems like UI, maybe an achievement, maybe this is how you, maybe at the end of your tutorial, you give the player a certain amount of experience or in-game currency or something like that. You would just bind to this event, and when this is called, you can then give the player that experience or whatever else you need. So we pass in the tutorial, and then we are going to set our current tutorial to null. And now in advanced step, we actually need to call this on true. So when we've exceeded the length of our current tutorial steps, we end the tutorial. So now let's make the function for starting a new tutorial. So start tutorial. This is going to have an input of tutorial data. So we're going to say tutorial data. So whenever we want to start a tutorial, all we need to do is pass in a data asset for the tutorial. And we're first going to make sure we don't have a tutorial active. So we're going to go is valid. If this is valid, that means we're already in a tutorial and we don't want to override it. So we're just going to return out of this function. But if we don't have a current tutorial active, we are going to set our current tutorial. We're going to create our widget, and we are going to advance step. There we go. So there's actually one thing we're missing here, but we don't currently have the setup we need to bind to our event. So what we're going to do is quickly pause from our tutorial manager, and we're going to create a function library. So I'm just going to put this in my managers folder. We can just call a function library bpfl managers. So in here, we're going to have a function for get gameplay event manager. We are going to get game instance, cast to BP. We haven't made our game instance yet. Let's quickly make our game instance because we've completely skipped that. So we're going to make a new blueprint class of type game instance. Bang. BP game instance. Sorry, I'm kind of skipping around. Skipped a couple steps. So on init, event init, we are going to create two objects. So we're going to construct object from class. First thing will be gameplay event manager. And we're just going to promote this to variable gameplay event manager. And then we are going to do this again, but we are going to create our tutorial manager. Promote to variable tutorial manager. Okay, and just so we don't forget, let's make sure we go to our project settings and actually enable our game instance. So now in our function library, we're going to cast to BP game instance. We are going to get gameplay event manager. And we will just return this gameplay event manager. And return null if it fails. And we can actually just duplicate this, get tutorial manager, which we'll need later. So might as well do it now. And it'll return a tutorial manager object reference. We'll get tutorial manager, and we will pass that in. And make sure this is called tutorial manager. So we have that. Now let's go back to our tutorial manager, and we can actually just move this out of the way. We are going to get outer object of ourself because we are going to need a world context object. We're going to call that get gameplay manager event. Now, you could oh, we didn't make it pure. Let's go back. Let's make these pure. In our function library, we need these two functions to be pure. So you could pass it in this way. You could also just cast here, cast to BP game instance. But we just created this function, so we might as well use it. So we're going to get our gameplay event manager, and we are going to bind to on gameplay event, that dispatcher we made earlier. And we will create event, and we will create a matching function and rename this on gameplay event. We'll come back to this function in just a minute. At the end of start tutorial, we need to advance step. Okay, so that's our start tutorial. We pass in a tutorial data asset. We check to make sure there isn't a tutorial already active. We update our current tutorial. If there is no tutorial active, we create the widget, we bind to the gameplay events, and we advance the step. So this is where we're actually going to start tying in the whole system, and hopefully everything will start to make sense of what we're doing. So on gameplay event, remember we have our gameplay event manager. We call on gameplay event whenever some kind of event happens that we might want to broadcast to other parts of the system. In the example we're going to use later, it'll be things like movement, shooting, jumping, that kind of thing. So when the player jumps, for an example, that's a gameplay event that maybe our tutorial manager needs to listen to, maybe our achievements manager, whatever else. So we're going to broadcast it. In this case, the tutorial manager is going to be listening to the gameplay events when a tutorial is active. And when an event happens, we need to check to make sure if it is or is not the current step of the tutorial. If it's that tag we're looking for. Remember, in our tutorial step, we have a required event tag. If it is the correct required event tag, that means we can advance to the next step. So all we're going to do, we're going to check to make sure our current tutorial is valid, because this will not work if we do not have a tutorial active. So if it is valid, if we do have a tutorial active at this time, we're going to get our steps, and we're going to get a copy at the index that we're currently at here. Then we're going to break our tutorial step so that we can get the tag. And if this tag equals the tag of the event that was just played, if those are equal, we are just going to advance step. And that's literally it. It's really that simple. So we are listening for events from the gameplay event manager. We have an active step index. If an event fires and it's the correct required event tag at our current index, we advance to the next step of the tutorial. Okay, so how do we actually use this tutorial manager? First thing we're going to need when we want to use a tutorial is to create a data asset. So we will create a new data asset inside of our data folder, and this will be of our type PDA tutorial. We'll call it data asset example tutorial. Let's open that up. Now what we can see is we have some data for our name, our steps, and the widget. So we haven't made the widget yet, so we'll come back to that in a minute. But the name, we'll just call it example tutorial. And for the steps, let's see, we'll have a few steps. The first one will be use WASD to move, and required event tags. So this is where we actually define our gameplay events. But this could be literally anything you want. So the way I like to structure this is we have a gameplay event tag. So we'll add that. And then under our gameplay event tag, we'll have our actual events. So let's say move could be one. We'll have one for jumping, maybe. Jump. And we'll do one more for shooting. Sounds good. Shoot. Okay, so WASD to move. That is a move event. And then here we will say space to jump, which will be our gameplay event jump. And then left mouse to shoot. Now these are just examples. They will be whatever events you need. And this list can go on and on and on and on and on, depending on how many events you need in your tutorial. And they don't have to be inputs as well. They could be player kills X amount of enemies, player reaches certain location, player talks to certain NPC. It could be any event you want, right? So our tutorial widget, let's make that really quick. This isn't going to be a super in-depth tutorial on widgets. We're going to make this very quick. And it's not going to be very pretty, but if you should probably animate it and whatnot and make it look all nice. That's out of scope for this tutorial. So we're just going to make a widget called tutorial. And we're going to make this super quick. So we're going to put a vertical box on the right of the screen. Let's move this up a bit. That looks fine. Site content. And we were going to add 2 text box to it. The first one will be text tutorial title. And we'll duplicate that and call this text tutorial instruction. And we'll just give this some default text. Instruction. And title. Okay. And now here's what we're going to do. Remember we have the event on activate new step. That's exactly what we're going to be using to update our text here in our widget. So we have that get tutorial manager function in our function library that we made. We're going to check to make sure it's valid. Always safer to do that. And then we are going to bind event to on activate new step if it's valid. If it's not valid, we're just going to remove from parent. So this widget won't exist if our tutorial manager doesn't exist. And we will create event, create a matching function on activate new step. So here, all we're going to do is set our text for our title and our instruction. So set text. Now, it might be smart to use text instead of strings for the types here. It depends on what you actually need. Maybe you need text only, so you should change this type to a text instead of a string. Maybe you need strings. Maybe it doesn't matter to you, but that option is always there to change the type. In this example, we're just using strings. So we now get our step. And remember, in each step, we have text that goes with it, right? So if we go back to our tutorial example, we have use WASD to move. That's our instruction. So that is what we are plugging in here to our instruction text. And that's all we need. So back in our data asset, we can go ahead and put in this widget blueprint tutorial. And this is how you would have different widgets depending on the tutorial that's active. You don't need to have that, but you have that option here. Okay, so we should have everything made for our system now. So how do we actually use it? Well, we're going to use our BP character as an example here. This just has some basic movement and some inputs for actions. That's it. So here in begin play, we're just going to start our tutorial. So we're going to get tutorial manager and we're going to start tutorial. And the tutorial is going to be our example. So whenever the game starts, we start our tutorial. So if we actually play right now, you'll see that tutorial pop up on the right. And it'll say our name and it will say our space to jump. Why does it say space to jump? Did we mess something up? That tells me our index is wrong. Or did I do this backwards? Let's see. Oh, it's because we put this to 0 to start with. So you could either on start tutorial reset. That's probably the better idea. Let's do that. So before we actually start our tutorial, let's set our current step index to -1. Now, remember when I was saying at end tutorial, we set this to -1? We don't actually need this now because now when we start tutorial, we set it instead of when it ends. And that's a little cleaner just because when, you know, if you make the system and you forget to put this to -1 as the default value, what we just saw happened will happen. So instead at start tutorial, we'll set this to -1. Just a little bit cleaner and avoid any unnecessary bugs like we just saw. So now when we play, we'll see WASD to move. We don't skip the step. But we don't have a way of advancing step yet. So now let's do that. We've now started the tutorial. So to advance the step, I'm just going to give myself a little bit more room here. Let's move all these out of the way. So we have our movement. Now we don't really want to do this in triggered because that'll happen every frame. Instead, let's go and hit this drop down. And when we start our movement input, what we're going to do is we're going to get our gameplay manager. And we are going to broadcast gameplay event. So whenever we start moving, we broadcast the event that we have started moving. And now any other system in the game that is listening to whether or not we start moving will be able to know. So the instigator is going to be ourself. And now our gameplay tag will just be our move, right? Again, this could be whatever event is being broadcast. In our case, it's going to be move. So now if we actually just go and look, what happens when I hit any movement key, we advance to the next step. Exactly what we want. Now all we have to do is tie in this exact functionality to all of our gameplay events that we need broadcasted to different parts of the game. So for this example, we are going to have jump, and we are also going to have shoot, which is just going to be our primary action, left click. And remember, these are on started, and you just have to remember to put in the correct event. So jump, and in this case, shoot. And so now what happens when I move? Oh, I'm lagging. So when I moved, we move on to the next step of the tutorial. When I jump, we'll move on to the next step. And when I left click, we'll end the tutorial because that's all the steps we have. Just like that, we have a tutorial manager. The player is not bound to the tutorial in any way. They're completely... Well, they're coupled in a sense of we're starting the tutorial in the player, but probably ideally you wouldn't start the tutorial from the player. It'd be somewhere else. But if we removed this, if we put this in a better spot, which we're not going to do for this example, the player would not be coupled at all with our tutorial manager, which is exactly what we want. We don't want the player to have to know anything about the tutorial. All we need the player to do is broadcast that events are happening. And then any system across the game can listen to those events. You can extend this system in a lot of ways. There's absolutely improvements you can make to everything I've shown here. One of the things that you can totally do, and I might even make a video on it in the future, maybe, is making an objective system or a quest system or an achievement system. They would all function very similar, having some kind of object, like the gameplay manager broadcasting events, and then these objective tutorial achievement managers are just listening for those events and then doing something if the right events actually occur. So for those that are interested in the actual pattern that we're using here. It's called the observer pattern. It's great for decoupling objects, as you can see, that are from completely different systems, but still need a way to talk to each other in some way. It's not a perfect system, but it's used a lot in game development, especially for things like UI, or this example, like an achievement or tutorial system. So I highly recommend, if you don't already use this pattern, to learn more about it and see what kind of stuff you can make with it, because it definitely helps clean up your code. We don't want to have a million checks, a million bools inside of the player to see if we're in the tutorial and if we have XYZ thing unlocked and all that. Instead, we just have our gameplay event manager broadcasting events. So that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, if I was unclear about anything, you can go ahead and ask in the comments and I'll give you a reply. If there's any other topics you want me to cover, let me know. And yeah, that's it. So I'll see you next time.